Photography was always something that I did. It was something that I enjoyed. I wasn't real serious about it in terms of wanting to become a photographer one day. That came much later.
Well, 2025 has struck. We're there, we've done it. And all those GDP spends of a modest international state to put on a fireworks show, timed appallingly with Beethoven's Ninth, have passed hopefully without too much of a problem. Animals of the world, you can come out from behind your couches again. Actually, in the UK, we did have some cancellations. Edinburgh's outdoor spectaculars in, they didn't really happen, the outdoors ones anyway. Storms stopped play for many of the celebrations, which is a pretty big deal actually, considering that as far as the UK is concerned, at any rate, Scotland is considered one of the pivotal places to be, to pipe in a new year in style. But you cannot have a false nine revealing what a true Scot wears beneath their tartan kilt lining with all the kids watching on live TV, can you now? And so we enter a 6th year of this podcast. I know I talk of 4 years within the introduction, but it seems I've been counting incorrectly. Only for a year or so, which is proof as to why I was better doing this job than the path of aviation I almost took. If 2020 was the first year, 2025 means we're entering a 6th period of play. It doesn't matter how many times I do that on my fingers. It still doesn't make sense. Can you check my maths, please? And have an answer on my desk by Monday. Right, office admin done. Here we are, out on our photo walks again. I hope that 2025 brings you great creativity and inspiration. A chance to play as well with your cameras and let your walking boots show you the world, even if that's just 2 miles from your front door, or maybe less. We have a super year of adventures and inspiration ahead on the show, which I'll talk more about when I dip into the mailbag. And the inspiration starts really with a guest I've honestly been waiting to talk with for quite a while. And that's a man whose YouTube films and photography I've followed very closely for years now. He has been, I would say, a constant alongside my own picture making for his technical and creative knowledge, for his ideas, for his suggestions of books and his thoughts about making and taking pictures. And I can't imagine, I'll include my other listener here as well, I can't imagine there'll be many, if any, listening today who haven't heard of Ted Forbes and the art of photography. And Ted, well, he's only gone and written a book, so he has, and I'll be discussing that with him today. Ted is the creative force then behind the Art of Photography YouTube channel, nudging ever closer to 1 million subscribers. He's spent years sharing his undeniable passion for the craft, whether he's unpacking philosophy, like talking about one of his favourite photographers, Henri Cartier-Bresson, or showcasing the quirks of vintage lenses, and yes, some of the more commercial kit stuff too. Ted has a way of making photography both, well, accessible actually, just accessible, including kit. And you know me, tech, if it is delivered like a college course, brings on a real nosebleed for me. So I reckon we get off to a cracking start today with my guest being Ted Forbes. And I can promise you this, well, as much as diaries allow, that this will not be the only time in 2025 you'll hear his voice on this show.
Today on the Photo Walk.
The language that I speak, which is going to be more of an improvisational. I don't like the term street photography necessarily, but it's candid photography, and you're documenting. And we go through that now. Look at Instagram where it's like, oh, it's gone to reels and video, and so all the stills are dead. No, stills are not dead. It's just a reinterpretation of what that is, and they'll live on some different way. I would go up to Borders, drink coffee, spill it on their books, and then I would go over to the half-price bookstore, the used books, and that's where a lot of my collection was built from, because it was stuff I could afford. I do what I do because it's what I have to do. There's something inside of me that has to create something, and it used to be music for me, but now I found my real calling in my home is photography.
That's Ted Forbes, my guest on the show today, and the first guest of 2025. Welcome along as we make our photo walk together. A show where we walk and make pictures photographically, sketchbooking our time together each week, enjoying the letters and inspirational stories you sent in and listening back to special studio conversations with guests from around the world. I'll take a peek into the mailbag in a moment for a flavour of today's letters into the show. But before that, I'd like you to know how thankful I am for those who've kept me walking with a microphone all these years, no matter how many Simply Counting allows. Thank you to those who believe in the cast enough that you're Patreon members, or extra milers, as I know you by. And also to mpb.com, who sponsored this show. If you've been hearing their name but haven't tried them yet, today, this year, is that day and year. MPB is a place where you can buy, sell, and trade your used photo and video gear. They really do make gear more accessible. They really do make gear more affordable. Cue the Neil, who'll tell you more about this with a couple of sound effects thrown in for good measure. A service I use for buying, selling, and trading used camera gear is MPB. As a website platform, mpb.com is the place where I can safely buy, sell and trade quality used photo and video gear online. And online guarantees make this a place I feel safe to buy from, unlike some other marketplaces. Here's how it works. You go online to mpb.com and search for gear that you'd like to add to your kit bag. Or if you're selling gear you no longer need, click the button at the top of the website that says Start Selling and Trading and just follow the very easy instructions. From there, you print off a packing label, stick it on the box with all your gear in it. It's collected by a courier free of charge from your front door. And the best bit, MPB pays you for your camera gear within days. So join me and the hundreds of thousands of photographers every year in the US, Europe and the UK who know that MPB is the place to buy, sell, trade and create. And by the way, the start of a new year is usually a good time to reevaluate, I think anyway, what you just haven't used in the last year. If you haven't used it, be honest with me now, look at me in the eyes, because it could be new to somebody else's kit bag and make you some cash in the process. Right, on the show today, Gavin Perry is proving that the world can be at your shutter fingertips without boarding a plane. He even has the peck marks on his photography hat from a visit to Cockatoo Island to prove it. Craig Wilson is yomping through Welsh landscapes, and Simon Blakesley has what I'm calling a personal pilgrimage picture. I'm wondering if actually we possibly all have one of those. One of our very special friends of the show, Paul Friday, has got me revisiting photographers who make pictures of things that aren't necessarily of this world. I'd like to tell you about our Photographic Encounters gig in April, which I'm hoping you'll join me on, and I have a brand new one-word assignment for the month, photographic inspiration, and a challenge set by our guest this week, Ted Forbes. Right, shall we walk? Checklist out. First one of the year then. Do you have your coffee? Check. Garibaldi's? Check. Walking boots? Definitely check. SD cards or a spare roll of film? Check. And for those a few days into their 365s, plenty of willpower for the next 300 and whatever days. Bearing in mind that's more counting for me. Check. Well, let's walk. It's a wonderfully crisp morning. Look at this. I'm up at the common, and Barnes, hold on a minute. Stop pulling me. He's on the lead at the moment because there's cattle just through the Barnes. Patience. There's cattle just through the woodland here. Right. Let's make a sketchbook of this. In front of me, it's wonderful, this common. It really is. There's woodlands, well, as you know, it's an old air base. So there's woodland, there's the runways. It's just a fantastic place to visit. And there's dense woodland as well. Let me get a picture of this. Hold on. F5, 1/60th, shutter speed 300th. And there we go. First sketchbook picture of 2025. Barnes, are we going to go that way? I've got a feeling it's going to take us into mud. Well, you've got your jacket on, I suppose. He did look at me in that way. You're not going to make me wear this, are you? Really? Really? All the other dogs aren't wearing these? Well, they are, some of them, actually. Saw a Labrador wearing one the other day. Looked mighty fine, he did. But I'm not sure this path goes anywhere. You're leading on, are you? If you have a picture or letter to send in and are gently nudged by anything you hear today, send them to stories@photowalk.show. Write letters. We will start with Gavin Perry. Hi, Neil. I've been listening to your podcast, and as an extra miler for a couple of years now, as we end 2024, move swiftly into 25, I wanted to drop you a mail and say thank you. Thank you for producing a top-quality podcast that's educational, inspirational, motivational, and any other word ending with AL, and deeply moving at times. Gavin, it's not too early in the year to hide behind the sofa of flattery, but I read this equally to throw my love and thanks back to you as well. To you, personally, yes. To our extended community, too. And even the other listener. I'm hoping for a 2025 that takes us to new places, physically and mentally, that is. Barney, you really are leading me into, and I can hear the traffic on one side. I've never been to this part of the woods here. Are you sure about this? Barnes? Anyway, says Gavin. One thing I've not embraced is the community aspect of the show, something I hope to change in 2025. Like many people worldwide, the pandemic transformed my work environment irrevocably. I now only work 2 days a week in the office, resulting in reduced physical activity and an excessive amount of time spent conversing with colleagues through video conferencing platforms like Microsoft Teams, Google Meet, and Zoom. Your show gets me off the bus to work twice a week, many stops earlier actually, and I walk and listen to you while I observe and photograph life happening around me. See, Gavin, now that is perfect. And it's reminding me beautifully, actually, of a couple of conversations that closed out 2024, in particular, the chat with Joe Madsen in episode 459. Where he recalled his heightened cholesterol count was responsible for stepping off the subway in New York much earlier than usual and walking the streets to work with a camera and eventually a street photography mission. During those times of restrictions, says Gavin, I was compelled to photograph more locally, which led to the birth of a new project called 8 Suburbs. This project showcases the 8 suburbs that comprise the local municipality where I live. These are long words, Gavin. Careful. I've lived in the area for over a decade, yet have never explored the wonders right beneath my nose. So in 2023, I embarked on another project, this time 33 suburbs, which represents the 33 suburbs of the city of Sydney. And these projects have become my urban diaries. You see, you had me at urban there. Urban diaries. Fantastic. I will leave a link to the website that has those 2 first suburb projects. Hang on a minute, pups. This is wonderful. Let me get another sketchbook picture. There's a tree. It's not quite sitting in a pool of light, but it's dappled with some light really coming in from the left. And I love it. In front of it is a carpet of leaves, which is just a four. You turn into a poet. The tree itself. Let me get one here. F5 again. There we go. Honestly, pups, I've not been to this bit before, but I quite like it. I've got no idea where it's leading. Probably to a dead end, but I do like it. I'll be in the UK, says Gavin, in Scotland for my dad's 80th birthday in April 2025. And thanks to you and your Scottish retreat, I've booked a darkroom session with my dad and my son. 3 generations of photographers together. Anyhow, this is turning into a long email. All the best for 2025. Oh, P.S. I can't recall if you've had James Poppis on the show. His videos and thoughts are always entertaining and thought-provoking. His recent video is particularly interesting. I shall have to go and see what you mean by that. How are we going to get through this bit, pups? But no, we haven't. So thank you for a few things here. Thank you for your kind words. Thank you for the introduction to the idea. I know of James Poppis. I've watched plenty of his videos. So thank you for the idea to perhaps at last in 2025 reach out and see if he'd come on the show. And, you never know. Hopefully we may get a chance to meet when you visit the UK. Not sure how far south in the country you're coming, or whether you're glued to Scotland land for that visit, which frankly is not a bad place to find yourself glued. And then your project, Suburbs. Fantastic. It really is. There's 3 actually suburb variants here, or variations. Don't like the word variants for obvious reasons. There's 8, there's 33, and now there is 658. And on the latter, 658, I was taking a scoot around the places that feature in your urban diary. Pups, don't go under there. He's gone underneath the fence. No, that's a private bit. You can't go in there. Get off my land. I can hear them coming. Look, come on, this way. So yeah, I was looking at your urban diary and 658, and I came across a place I know well, Cockatoo Island, which is one of my favourite memories from my own trip to Sydney many years ago now. I made a short film actually from or on the island. Sits right in the middle of Sydney Harbour and has what you might call a bit of a checkered history. It started as a penal colony in the 1800s. Stand by, history lesson coming. Later on became a key shipbuilding and dockyard spot. And these days, though, it's more, well, you go to the museum, it's more about culture than hard labour. We went on a tour. I loved it so much. I went back twice. So much of Sydney to experience and explore. And I went back to their former penal colony sitting in Australia's harbour twice. It's like a less daunting Alcatraz in some ways, if you squint. But if I go back there again, I'm going back with a crash helmet next time, because what they don't tell you is that you're very likely to get dived on by large, very large silver gulls. I actually hid in one of the old warehouses to escape on a particular one that I think had it in for me. I did a bit of research. I read this about them. Silver gulls can be particularly protective during nesting season, which typically occurs from August to December, and may exhibit aggressive behaviour to defend their nests. It's advisable to maintain a respectful distance from these birds during this period to avoid any potential confrontations, I'll say. In one, quote, confrontation, a chap ahead of me by about, it wasn't far ahead, 10, 20 metres max, he had his sun hat knocked clean off his head. So they don't mess about, these gulls. Note to anybody else being buzzed by gulls, tripods, that's what you need. Not to hit them with, no, before you accuse me of that, just hold them above your head and it confuses them. Totally. So, yes, they call it Cockatoo Island, which sounds all very serene and beautiful and picturesque and full of colourful birds that are like living bouquets with wings made of candy floss, when in actual fact, you're more likely to come into contact with 100 winged, screeching thugs. Anyway, Gavin, or Gavlar, as you may need to be called thanks to the success of a certain comedy in this country, enjoy your trip in April. You never know, perhaps we will get a chance to meet. The winds that we've had over the last couple of days, they would have died down by then, because we'll be entering all the loveliness of spring. And you'll be free to move about in whatever cut of tartan you should choose. I shall leave a link to your work on the show page today. Come on, pups. This is no, don't go down there. It's like a cliff edge. Come on, this way, this way. What are you doing? You're hoping to abseil today, are you? Hey? Mountain climber. I know we have new members of our community joining us all the time, so welcome along to this podcast. This is Barney behind me, right on cue. What do you want? What have you seen? Squirrel? What? What's the matter? 2025, is it? What's your resolutions? Bit angry, if you don't mind me saying. I'm hoping to get David Sedaris on the show, the American humorist. I know he's not a photographer, but I think we'd have a fantastic photo walk together. He's refused me once, but I'll try again. But he doesn't like dogs' barns, so With that attitude, you certainly won't be coming with us. Come on, walk ahead, come on. Now, I know, where was I? I know we have new community members joining us all the time, so you're very welcome. For those that are new, or those that have been around for a while and thought, you know what, I really want to send in a letter to the show. Make 2025 the year where you do that, please, because I'd love to hear from you. This show's very unique. Well, it is unique in terms of a photography podcast, in that the glue that holds the whole thing together is very much you and this mailbag I haul happily around with me, and of course, this community that we're all building together. Letters can be about all manner of stuff, so they can. Projects you're working on, be they grand ones or maybe inklings of an idea. But I also want to hear about your travels with a camera this year or last year. Things that you may not have seen, or people you may not have spoken with. That's very relevant for this year, and a running theme we'll have through the shows. Had you not had a camera by your side for good company, I've always believed that these boxes we carry, whatever flavour they are perhaps the most important passport that we have. Because they are the passport, say it together now, to curiosity, and you just can't put a price on that. If you're sending in pictures, that's fantastic too. Send them to stories@photowalk.show. It's 2,500 pixels wide, if you can. That's the size we show pictures on the show pages. And remember your links to your websites, your social feeds. Now, sometimes, that's so we can link back to you, by the way. Sometimes I get to your letters straight away. Sometimes they wait for a suitable show theme. And sometimes they just seem to wait for a while, maturing. Like a fine Italian wine, Neil? Yes. Like a fine, well, maybe Italian cheese. The one still left in the refrigerator from Christmas. Every time we open the door, a little alarm goes off at the moment. But that email address again, as I'd love to hear from you this year, is stories@photowalk.show. An email that Craig Wilson sent back in November, where, well, he sent 2 super photos that feature on the show page today. His letter sometimes, says Craig, we go out with our cameras, we never get any shots we particularly like, but that's okay, because there are other times we don't expect anything special and come away with unplanned pictures we absolutely love. The landscape photo, which I will put on the show page today from Craig, is one from a recent visit to Wales, doing quite a few walks with camera in hand. And then the one of the Northern Lights, well, that one is actually from my back garden in Sunderland. A truly amazing sight to capture. No further than a few steps away from my back door. Hopefully you and your other listener have a good week with your cameras. All the best from Craig Wilson. Thank you, Craig. Those 2 photos are proudly part of today's show page gallery, renamed for 2025. And I have to say that, your work is always fantastic. It's beautifully composed. I have spent quite a lot of time lingering over your compositions on your Instagram. But that building that you've sent in this time, the one on the lake's edge, it looks like it's being devoured by a mountain lake. But the tree to the left of the frame, You've just wonderfully picked up on a foreground hero tree. Almost a mallee tree, maybe a mallee tree, could be. I'll leave a link to your Insta, which, as I say, is fantastic. It's a plethora of perfection. And one of the most recent pictures of that beautifully whitewashed house in the shadow of a mountain in Glencoe. That has me reaching for my teleporter, which sadly is still not working. Looking ahead to the year, Craig, I'm looking forward in particular to more of your travels with a camera. Right, time for part 1 of my 2 parts of my conversation today with a real, and I hope you don't mind me saying, hero of mine. It's okay to have heroes. His channel, The Art of Photography, if you have not seen it yet, is definitely one to subscribe to. Here's part 1 of my chat today with Ted Forbes. Over the last 4 years, Ted, I imagined the first question I'd ask you as I watched your films. And I hope we don't get off on the wrong foot by me asking you something that you must have been asked 100 times before. Stand by. But it's a question I've asked some photojournalists and some wildlife photographers, but I think you're more than qualified than any to answer it, because your YouTube channel is called The Art of Photography. Mm-hmm. So, photography, is it art?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, photography can be a lot of different things, as you know. I definitely live on the art side of it. The whole idea of photography can fulfill a commercial need. It can sell shoes, It can be a photojournalistic thing. It can show you what's happening around the world in a conflict. Although I've done videos on this before, and you've probably seen them, where I think that photography is always interpreted. It comes through. I mean, even if it's not a software thing. It's not a computer thing. It's the fact that a human being is holding the camera and deciding what to show. It adds a layer of interpretation into photography. And that's not a slight to photojournalists. I know photojournalists, and I highly, highly respect what they do. It's very difficult. And they ride this line all the time. The whole idea between truth and interpretation. And it is interpreted. It has to be. I live in the art side of things, obviously, and my entire world is interpretive. So what I decided to show is exactly what comes from me as a person, and that's what makes me a photographer. It's what makes anyone a photographer, but I embrace that. And so to answer your question, is photography art? I think all of photography definitely has some artistic quality to it, but it definitely can be an art. And, you look at people like Hiroshi Sugimoto, who just blow the doors open in terms of conceptual ideas and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, the simple answer is yes. But the more complex answer is to what degree, I think, because there are all kinds of photography. But that's what fascinates me about it. People who do commercial work and they're required to do, just a white backdrop and set something up, there's skill that's involved with all of it. And, the choices that we make and what we want to do and what we're really good at. But I think definitely it is an art.
I wonder how much advancements in camera tech have actually impacted that as an art.
Sure.
Because the purists would say, it was a lot harder in my day.
Right. I still think it is. I mean, I think it actually, this may be controversial too, but I think from my side of things, I think it creates another challenge now because like for instance, all the camera companies in the last 10 years have just put this huge emphasis on autofocus, and it's gotten really good. That's one aspect of a camera. Auto exposure is another one. I mean, it's gotten so good that anybody sure can lift a camera up and push a button. And get the image. You don't have to work on the exposure as much. You don't have to work on focus as much. And so those things come into play. But I think it creates, for those of us that are purists, people like you and me that have been around a long time, it does create another layer in there because I don't want the camera, the computer system in there to select my focus point, for instance. It does a pretty good job at it and you can control it. But to me, that's just another skill. And, God bless Sony. They've done so well with that, and they've literally pushed everyone's hand on that. But at the same time, I think they've made it a little bit difficult if you're a beginner photographer to break out of those things. And you don't always want the nearest point to be in focus. You don't always want the person in the image to be in focus. And again, we're talking about highly interpretive art photography at this point. But I think for me, those things are, it creates a new layer of difficulty, if you will, over the top because of the perfection that they give. I was talking to somebody the other day, the fact that, with Leica, they still make a rangefinder camera, but it doesn't have in-body image stabilization to it, right? One could argue that if you go through all the old pictures of the photographers that were known for using a rangefinder system, Henri Cartier-Bresson, W. Gene Smith, the list goes on, and you look at their pictures under a microscope, you could find problems with any of the famous photographs in the history of photography. And yeah, they don't have IBIS in them, so they do have a little bit of motion in them sometimes, and it's part of the look. You could consider that. So it just depends on what you're after, and there's so many people today that are after that perfection of it. I'm not. And so, yeah, I do end up fighting the system a little bit with the technology that we have.
It's interesting, though, that not all tech is as new as we think it is. Have I dreamt this? Or did Canon actually have a film camera that had retina focus?
Yeah, they did. The EOS 3, I think it was. Yeah. A friend of mine gave me his old one, and it's been on my shelf for like 10 years. I've been meaning to put batteries in and test it. And actually that's an interesting technology because I have used it in the newer Canons, and it is, it's not perfect, but it is pretty cool. And the whole idea that I can tell the camera with my eye where I want that focus point to be is very interesting. And so, I think that may be a rare example of something today that's a technology that still is trying to incorporate the human into it. And Canon will only get better at stuff like that. And, eventually maybe something that's very usable in which you think it would be. But, at the same time, and you're probably going to laugh at this, but when you look at a depth of field scale, when you really consider, depending on what focal length you're using, what depth of field really is, how hard is it to turn a tube? It's a skill that's not as difficult as people think that it is. But unless you're using a 135 lens or something like that, then it becomes a little more difficult. But yeah, I think all that stuff is very interesting for sure. Does it make you a better photographer or a worse photographer? I don't think so. I think it's something to be incorporated. And, there are certain types of photography, for instance, sports would be one of them, where perfect autofocus definitely is a major asset to what they're doing. For me, it's not. And I want to stress that, because you'll have listeners on this that well, wait a minute, he's just making the sweeping generalization. And I don't mean for it to be necessarily. Photography encompasses a large world, and so my opinion would definitely be from my world, but and I think you and I are probably close on that same page. But there are photographers where that is very useful for them to have. I talked to a sports photographer once at a Sony event, and I asked him, "Do you really shoot 30, 50, 120 frames a second to get your shot?" When you look at some of the old Sports Illustrated stuff from the 60s and 70s, there's some wonderful sports pictures. And he looked at me, he said, "Yeah," he said, "the way he looks at it is it raises the bar." Those guys had a certain bar, and they also put the bar at a certain place. And now we have more that we can do. And so for him personally, he said, there's no excuse not to get what I'm after. So it's just different ways of looking at it. And it's very interesting where we are today.
Well, we're going to talk about your book, Visually Speaking. But
Sure.
Before I ask a first question about that, I do want to know a little bit about you.
Sure.
Your start in so far as photography was an interest. I know that you grew up with pictures throughout your house. That was partly your story, wasn't it? Where does it all come from? Your absolute fascination, your love.
Well, my first return question to you is, how long do you have? But I can give you the gist of it. Definitely think, there was an artistic side to me that was very appealing even as a kid. I was fortunate to grow up in a family that was very supportive of the arts. My dad's was an illustrator, did commercial work. He's a painter now and does fine art. My mother was an interior designer. My sister was a graphic designer, or still is. Both of them are. And so I grew up in a house that, my parents would take us to museums when I was a kid, and we would look at master paintings, and they really encouraged that. And for me, starting out, I had my first camera when I was probably 10 or so, fourth grade. Got it for my birthday. It was a little Kodak 110. You remember the long cameras for the cartridge?
We were talking about those just the other day. My mum had one. I remember.
Yeah,
I remember loading it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, pop it in.
Yeah.
Yeah, you save your yard mowing money, and mom would take me over to the what do they call them? The photo huts in the U.S. But they were these they'd stand in the parking lot, and it was big enough for one guy to sit in and take film, and they made fun of it on That 70s Show when it was on television. But that's what we would do is I'd take my film over there, and you get double prints because they'd have the special or whatever. Yeah. But it would take a week to get your film back, and it was always really exciting to wait and see what you were able to get. I remember the first pictures that I took, but through that, photography was always something that I did. It was something that I enjoyed. I wasn't real serious about it in terms of wanting to become a photographer one day. That came much later. Music was my thing when I was in high school. Probably about the age of 14 or so, I started playing guitar and piano. And I was fortunate enough to go to an arts high school, and I got really good music training there, and then went and got a degree in college in music. And when I graduated, I realized very quickly that music, by the time I was graduating college, Napster was coming out, and the music business was radically changing.
I remember it. Yeah.
And I wanted to do film scoring, and I realized the only way to do that was to move to Los Angeles, starve for another 10 to 20 years, and ghostwrite for people, and try to get my way in the door. And at that point, I just didn't have the patience for it. The tech boom was in full swing, so I worked for a software company and did some other things. And I was kind of having this personal crisis of what I wanted to do. I had this need within myself I wanted to express myself through music at the time. And it was really, it was kind of depressing that it wasn't going to happen, I knew. And it was okay, but I wanted something that I could do. And then photography started becoming appealing to me again. And this was the start of like a lot of the digital revolution. Canon had come out with that little Kiss camera, whatever, the little gray one that everybody had. And it wasn't real good. It was okay. And about that time, I was like, you know what? Film is still really good. So I went way back into it. And I was processing my own film for the first time and really got into photography. But I didn't necessarily want to do it for a living because I have freelanced enough in my life to know that when you work with something as a career, somebody else is telling you the pictures that they want to get. And so you're going to have to do all your stuff based on what somebody's asking for. And again, much respect for people who do that. There is an art to that, and getting good ideas through is very challenging. And I wasn't very good at that. And so around that time, YouTube had come along, and it really wasn't YouTube. Originally, it was video podcasting. And that was really appealing to me. And I realized that I could talk about photography, and I could teach, and I could have these conversations with people around the world via the internet with video all of a sudden. That was just really appealing to me. So I just kind of went for it. And it was just something that was a hobby for a long time. I had a day job working for an art museum producing multimedia. So I was doing video and some coding and whatever they were asking for. And it finally got to the point where the channel was taking over. And it's nice because my whole career has allowed me just to do my own personal work. So on the one hand, there's been no shoe on me to get really good. It's all been at my own pace. So it was much later when I felt like I was really comfortable with things. But that's the short story about how I got all the way around to it.
Visually speaking, the book is then this continuation of this passion, isn't it?
Absolutely.
For teaching the art that is photography.
Oh, well, let me mention that too, because that's a really interesting segue. When I started getting interested in photography and getting serious about it, and I'm definitely well into my 20s at this point, probably almost 30, because I have a formal education in music. There is music theory and there's tonal theory. And so you deal with scales and you deal with chords and you deal with, counterpoint, and you deal with rhythm and you deal with, all the constructs of those things. So there's a mathematical network that you base everything off of that defines the language that it is. And when I got into doing visual work, it really is funny because I don't think it's that much different in some ways. In fact, it's a lot less abstract than me. If I hit middle C on the piano, how do you describe that to somebody who's never heard music? It's a tone, right? And so it's an abstraction. But when I see something, everybody can kind of relate to that because we all are used to identifying objects or people or skies or houses or whatever it is we're looking at. And so I was wanting there to be some kind of definition around that language. And there sort of is. We have things like rule of thirds, we have rule of odds, these principles that kind of come from Greek and Roman concepts. But really, on the whole, it's nothing like music theory is. And so it was always fascinating to me to kind of come up with these connections to music. And so a lot of what you're going to read in Visually Speaking is based on that. Yeah. And some of it is other things that I based myself on observation with. And so it's not... You don't have a mathematical structure to it. Some people really want to make it that, and you sort of do because you can get into rule of thirds and Fibonacci series and so on and so forth. And I found that if you're creating art based on that stuff, it's usually pretty cold in the end, and it's stuff that's very difficult for people to relate to. But anyway, I felt like when the publisher approached me to do the book that I had something to say that was going to be very different for a photography book. It wasn't the usual regurgitation of here's how to develop film or here's how to use an exposure triangle or, I had something to say in terms of actually making composition or making art. And the way I say it is developing your voice, because the idea of the book is comparing photography to, we have this visual language that we're all learning how to speak. You and I are using language right now in the oral sense, and I'm talking to you right now. Neither one of us are thinking about the subject, the verb, the predicate. What kinds of conjugation is it perfect? We're just speaking, and the reason we're doing that is because we've learned language and we've used it our entire lives. It's something we practice every day, and I think that visual communication is something that is very similar. This is something that could go into selling shoes or doing product photography or doing photojournalism. You're doing the same communication. You have to have something to say, and you need to know how to say it. And usually you need to be able to get experience doing that. The book is not going to make you a better photographer just by reading it, but it'll give you things to think about that might open up doors for one that is interested.
You spend a lot of time reviewing other people's work, and I found this interesting, actually. You're poring over the pages of other people's work. I've watched so many films of you doing it. It must be a bit strange being the other side of the page, as it were.
maybe a little bit, but I mean, I'm very comfortable with critique, and what that again comes from is when I started playing guitar, I think most people did when they're a teenager and they're into Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin. You go through your big classic rock phase, but that's how you learn guitar. You put on the records and you figure the solos out and you figure the riffs out, and you do it just by emulating. So in doing that, you're already analyzing the musician or the band that you're trying to play. And so again, for me with photography, because I was looking for that way to learn and I wasn't finding it in a theoretical sense from a book or anything like that, it's like, okay, well, and it always fascinated me that photographers didn't seem to embrace it. In fact, I think a lot of artists, painters do, photographers don't. And maybe some of that has to be because the medium is fairly young in comparison with something like painting or sculpture or architecture or things that have been around for numbers of years, numbers of centuries even. Photography is, 200-ish years old at this point. For me, though, it's like I can learn by emulating, and you're not going to transcribe a photograph in the same way you would a guitar solo. Because there's too many variables that you couldn't get close enough. But I can look at the way, I don't know, I'm just grab somebody out of the air. Michael Kenna composes, right? Very minimal compositions. He likes things in the center. I mean, it's very conventional and very classical in terms of the technique that he uses. But there's so much to learn through that and being able to look at his work and communicate that. And so when I started the channel and I had people that were all of a sudden sending books to me and they were wanting my opinion and to celebrate the spirit of creativity, I would bring that and I would share it on the channel. And more recently, I've gotten a little more critique oriented with it and started pointing out areas that could be worked on a little bit. But it's very easy because I've looked at a lot of work over the years, and you start to see the big difference between Michael Kenna and somebody who just sent you a book who maybe has been photographing for 2 or 3 years. And they're very serious about it and they're very interested, but you can start to point out those reasons why in their own work that maybe they're not on that level. And I don't mean to do that in a tear down kind of way. It's a lift up kind of thing. But actually pointing that out. Because, I mean, a lot of us, I think for me, it was hard to look at my own work for a long time.
Was it?
I would take pictures and move on to the next, right. And I wouldn't go back and really analyze what it was that I was doing. And so I was pretty slow until I started to have that relationship with my own work where I was actually looking at it more analytically and trying to figure out what could have changed within this. And it could be any number of things, obviously. But, should I have been more patient and waited for the moment? Should I have composed differently? Should I have stood in a different place? Should I have used a different lens? All those things. And then finally, you start getting things that work and that you are happy with and then that you're very content with.
I'm really interested in this concept of the visual language that you mentioned. Sure. And maybe you touch on this in the book, but do you think it's something that can come or comes instinctively or can be trained or learned, gathering 100%. Inspiration as you go?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, everybody has some kind of aptitude and things that they're better at than others. Obviously, I'm not much of a math person, so don't put me in a calculus class because it's going to be very difficult because my interest level is low. But as long as your interest level is into the topic, which is photography that we're talking about, my personal feeling is that, it is a language. We can start to look at things in terms of, here's a syntax, here's what a noun is. I mean, we have those in photography. Your subject would be a noun. I could take any photo like the stuff that's behind me, and I know that your listeners can't see this, but I have an Avedon portrait of a boxer's fist. Yes, yeah. And it's a really interesting photograph because of what's not there. It's all fist, right? There's very little around it. And I love that picture because of that. In the subject is the hand, or it's actually the boxer. It's sort of a portrait in some ways, which is classic Avedon, but that picture is very different for Avedon. And then what's the verb? What's the action that's being shown there? So that's just in a very basic sense, but then we could color that with other things. That's a bad example because it's so minimal, but I've got an Arnaud Cartier-Bresson over here that's very complex. And so what's happening? What is the action that's in there? And then what are the other things that are in the photograph that support that? And so we could look at that. My comparison here, my metaphor would be sentence structure. Now, we can study those things when we look at the pictures, but there's no, there is reasons why things exist and reasons why things work. And the idea is to get yourself to the point where you understand those and then you can forget about them. But you have to learn them and you have to internalize them and you have to understand what that work is. And most photographers don't. They don't understand the history of what's become before them. And the problem is then a lot of people come up with something and they think they're breaking new ground when it's actually been done before and they're not doing it. There would be a way to do that in a continuous way. But that's the idea. It's just the same as language. Like I said, we're not sitting here thinking about sentence structure or what words mean, or, we're able to just speak. because it's internalized. Our brain just does this naturally. And I can explain something to you, or you can explain something to me, or we can ask questions of one another if there's something that we're missing. And I think photography can be the same. It doesn't necessarily mean you ever stop learning, but it means that you get really good at it, you get successful at it when you've internalized a lot of those components. And, I say this in the book, but as a photographer, what people don't realize is we're responsible. Generally we have a rectangular surface that we're projecting an image onto, or a square. But you're responsible for every square centimeter that's in that canvas, right? And so in painting, one would start by making a mark, and then they make a second mark, and then you continue to add. And I've always been very jealous of painters because they control everything in the image, for better or worse. And then they build that composition based on that. It could be something based on reality, but it's all kind of from the mind. And so we call that an additive process. Add one mark, add to the next. You add a wash, you add a color, whatever it is, texture. So photography, we don't add anything. It's all before the camera, right? In general, the photography is not additive. It's a subtracted process, because generally speaking, if you look at street photography, for example, the moment you press that shutter, whether it's a successful image or not, there are going to be things in there that you're not responsible for. And if they detract from the image, they didn't belong there. And that's when you have to wait a moment, or you have to recompose, or you have to be patient. And that's why, Cartier-Bresson was just the master at all of that. The guy didn't take many duds. Of course, we're only seeing the great stuff, but there's a lot of great stuff. And it's always like that. It almost looks like it's set up, and it wasn't. And there's a real beauty to that he was so good at just making sure that it was subtracted down to the key elements that belonged in the composition. I think any successful photographer is like this. Now, sometimes we do control the composition. If you're doing studio photography or portraits, sure, you do have a lot of control over the lighting and things like that. But in general, I think successful photographs, at least the way that the language that I speak, which is going to be more of an improvisational. I don't like the term street photography necessarily, but it's candid photography, and you're documenting. And so therefore, I don't want to art direct the scene. I want to capture the scene in the moment that I see that it's going to communicate what it is that I want to say as a photographer.
I want to actually pick up the language thing. You're talking about the spoken word. I remember during my radio training, when it was compared to TV, it was suggested that the spoken word and radio paints a stronger, more potent picture than what you're being fed as a moving picture. And I wonder if there's a similar relationship. Again, I'm sure you'll mention this in your book, in terms of the still and then the moving image. A clear example to me is, and it might be something you have thoughts on anyway, whether it's in the book or not, but a clear example is one of the Vietnam War. But it's the stills that stick in my mind. Nick Ute's image, for one, it instantly comes to mind. I wonder whether still images stay with us in a way that moving images can't.
Oh, absolutely. And I love your comparison of radio and television too, because, what we're talking about essentially are mediums where an element is removed from reality, right? Yeah. So if you compare radio to television, you don't have the visual. It's only the oral, the language that is spoken. And so for you as doing radio, and this, that you have to tell your story in a very different way because you're missing that component. I think photography is the same. Photography, you're missing the element of time. Yeah. Whereas motion, you have that element of time. And so you can show that, but you have to do it in a different way. I think another, maybe not as dramatic, but the difference between color and black and white photography. When you remove that element of color, there's another element of reality that's been pushed away. And so I think when those mediums that are, we'll call them for the sake of argument here, reduced mediums, they can be much more powerful, I believe. It's funny because when things come along, it's like, oh, this is going to kill off this. And we go through that now. Look at Instagram where it's like, oh, it's gone to reels and video, and so all the stills are dead. No, stills are not dead. It's just a reinterpretation of what that is, and they'll live on some different way. Radio didn't die out. And look at podcasting as an example of that. People like long form content while they're driving, or while they're on a plane, or while they're on a train, or whatever that is. So it always has a place for an audience, and I think photography is the same. You're not going to put stills on the news, certainly, unless that's all you have. But you're right. I think the Vietnam War is a great example of that, because that was the first televised conflict. And so, but it didn't mean that the pictures went away or that they don't exist. And they are more powerful. And I think that when you look at the staying power, if you look at something that's just designed to be a news clip, movies have the staying power, but that's different. They're not based on newsreels necessarily. If you look at Apocalypse Now, it's a story, and it's told through the element of time that goes through it. But you don't have that element of time in the same way in a photograph, and you've got to be able to essentially communicate what's going on in something that's a frozen moment.
And Ted Forbes is back shortly. This year we have quite a few adventures I'm looking forward to, and I'm going to tell you more about one new one in a moment or three. Oh, it's lovely out here today. Look at this, pups. Look. I love this soft moss covering. The greens are really alive following all the rain of the last few days. Look at that. I'm using my X100V today, which is one of the cameras. There's a sketchbook picture. Hopefully that'll bring out those greens. One of the cameras I intend to take to India this year. I'm really taken though by I will be taking a film camera as well. I'm really going to be making more photographs on my film camera this year. I've been inspired for all sorts of reasons. Here's a wonderful next letter into the show from our friend Simon Blakesley. Hello, Simon, our aviation photography friend. Although this is nothing to do with aviation, this letter. The pictures I'm about to talk about will be on the show page today. And if you can think of something for me whilst I read this letter, it'll help bring the words alive in a context perhaps you're not quite expecting. So imagine this. You're holding an old photograph in front of you today in 2025. And you're at a particular place that evokes memories for you. And you've lined this black and white picture up perfectly in front of the scene where it was taken 7 decades ago. Hello, best greetings from Yukon land, Neil, says Simon. I hope all is well with you and yours. On my third listening and reflection upon episode 458 with Sean Tucker about imposter syndrome et al., I was reminded again about the one-word assignment on the show set by Lynn Fraser and Jackie Materchuk, that word being connection. When looking back upon my aviation photography, when it came to the word and joining in with the assignments, I kept drawing a bit of a blank, trying to recall an image that in some way would make the grade, so to speak, for this challenge. And then I had one of those deep mental clunk moments while listening to you and Sean in the episode, looking back over the almost complete year. An image I took over the summer when visiting Leicester and family for the first time in 25 years re-entered my consciousness. Before making the trip, I felt compelled to carry an image from my parents' wedding, taken at a small 11th century church. A picture made back in 1954, a picture I kept in my camera bag. It would have been Mum and my photographer Dad's 70th anniversary this year. While they're no longer with me and my 3 older brothers, my 96-year-old aunt is, and she's in the wedding photograph, standing beside my grandfather, and I actually got to see the picture I carried on that trip. I must admit, I haven't been able to quite find the words that would adequately describe the profound and manifold feelings I experienced in that moment where I held Mum and Dad's wedding picture up against the backdrop where it was actually taken all those decades ago. Very few words, more than a few tears, I'm not shy to admit. There's still a lot for me to unpack, I realise, as there often is when you're reflecting upon a family's life course that extends over a century. But what did strike me was the deep connection I felt to that exact spot, my family and my inner being at that moment. This is where, on that day, at least from the official standpoint of a relationship being consecrated, the connections that formed my immediate family and its journey began, then endured for 70 years and continue to grow to this day. What a wonderful story. Really, just very, very special. And your letter, come on pups, this way. That's the road. This way, come on. Your letter reminded me of a similar picture that I've been meaning to do something with in that kind of fashion for some time now. It's a picture that was made of me as a young, much better looking, certainly more cutesy boy with I would have been, 4 or 5 at the time, with a big shock of blonde hair. Maybe I was 3, maybe I was a bit younger, held in my dad's arms. He's holding me in front of a particular location in Amsterdam. It's a wool shop that's still there to this day. It's a famous landmark. It sits next to a canal. And I've been dreaming I have, really, of returning to that place to do a similar picture. It feels like a picture pilgrimage in many respects. I'm guessing the picture, well, it's over 50 years old by a good amount. Come on, pups, by a good amount. And it would have to be it wouldn't have to be a special trip. There's so much of Amsterdam to see. Maybe one of our encounters could be in Amsterdam. Tell you about that shortly, but it's a place I'd love to go to. And your photograph, Simon, right at the head of the year. And this letter that I'm reading out is a total inspiration. I love the story, and the pictures will be on the show page today. Having talked about connections there, let's have a chat about a word closely related. I mentioned it a moment ago, that called encounters, or that being encounters. India 2025, well, that's fully booked. So too is Scotland in September, both weeks. But this year, I'm introducing something new, which is called encounters. And there are still places left on this. You're invited to step away from the screen and onto the bustling streets of London for our first one-of-a-kind 2-day non-residential photography experience. Try say that quickly. 4 times in a row, please. It's designed for Photo Walk podcast listeners who are, and I know you are, passionate about making pictures and your storytelling and also exploring history. And connection with like-minded photographers, connection with people you might meet on the street, and connection with the special places that we're going to visit. This is very much a photographic and social experience, really, to encourage and inspire and build upon your storytelling skills. I like this part of it, by the way. Some surprise challenges have been set by established street shooters, which are not too tricky, but they will have you thinking outside the box, as they say at corporate towers. Plus, we'll have some fun learning about London's past, and we'll work as a group. And then there's the encounter part of the whole thing, which could be a person that you photograph, somebody you meet for the first time, or it could be a place, actually, within the story that you're telling. We're going to work through these challenges together, developing and learning some new skills as we go, stepping beyond the recognised format of street photography workshops. Just something a bit different, or very different, because we're going to create a zine and a podcast feature from our special 2 days spent together. Where's that water flowing from? This is the thing about, I've said this before, about walking up at Greenham on the Common, because it used to be an airbase. There's sometimes you come across stuff that shouldn't be in the middle of woodland at all, and that must have been a drain maybe from one of the runways. Anyway, if you'd like to go with me and others on encounters, it is now booking up. The 2 dates are Thursday 24th and Friday the 25th of April. Go to the Photo Walk website, which is photowalk.show. Look for the Encounters tab in the menu. Bring camera. I'll supply the coffees and experience. And of course, I'll remember to bring a couple of packets or 8 of Garibaldi's too. Right, let's start a new year of assignments, shall we? I've decided to continue with the one-word assignment, since as the year went along, it really started to pick up some fantastic momentum. So I thought, well, let's have that for another year, and then we'll think of something else. It's way too early yet, Neil. I know. We'll think of something else next year for 2026. Later on during the year, that is. Anyway, one-word assignment. I'll tell you how you can take part in it in a moment. It's set by this week's guest, Ted Forbes. I thought that was a great place to start. I'm surprised in many ways that we haven't actually had this style of assignment yet, but it's a perfect way to start the year, so it is.
The Photo Walk assignment.
Ted, a one-word assignment to kick off 2025. What's it going to be?
I'll just pull one out. Let's say red.
I like the simplicity. Why red?
So I've gotten into this idea of, and it's not my idea, but studying Japanese aesthetics, visual aesthetics, that have kind of a collection of things in the 20th century that were amalgamation of trying to bring Eastern concepts to the West. But the whole idea of, there's one of the concepts called one red spot, where there's one red spot in the image. And what that means is not necessarily there's one red dot in the image, but it means that there's something that's contrasting to everything else in the image that's small in size, that carries a lot of weight. And I love that. I also find color to be very interesting too. It's something that I like to avoid when I shoot black and white. But when I do incorporate, I believe that it needs to be there for a reason. And what is interesting to me is the weight of color. And red is a really tough one because our eye is so tuned into it. There's a recent campaign that Leica's done on Instagram where they've done all these images that are predominantly red, and I think they're overdone. And I get it. You know, they have one red dot on their cameras. But anyway, it's a little obvious. So here's the assignment: is go out and try and incorporate the color red some way, shape, or form. Try and use it as a contrast. Try and use it as something that's small in the composition but carries a lot of visual weight. I think that's a really interesting challenge.
So the best of luck. Send your pictures to stories@photowalk.show. Send one picture only, please. I know there's two of Ted's to show the idea of the challenge, but one picture, please. 2,500 pixels wide if you can optimize it. If you can't, don't worry, say it together. I'll do the heavy lifting. No borders, no watermarks. Do make sure you send me links to your amazing work so that I can link back to you, your website or your socials on the show page or the assignments page. And yes, we'll use some of the pictures on our Instagram, because that's a wonderful way to grow the community and find more friends to walk along with. The assignments page actually for this one is up. So yes, think red. I'm being cautious, of course, of saying see red for obvious reasons. And we'll need a winner from last month, where the assignment was humour. And the winner is, drum roll please, do your own sound effects. A tricky one this actually, because so many, as always, caught my eye. But this one, and because of in some ways, because of the reaction it also received when I was showing it to a few friends, I think it has to be from Jean-Maurice Cormier, who made a street picture of what looks like, well, it is 3 bronze elephant statues in an urban setting. And there's an adult elephant and 2 babies, or calves, as they're correctly called. And the calves, they're linking together like young elephants do, or all elephants, by trunk and tail. So 3 elephants in a line, and just behind them, in the same line, is a janitor who's pushing before him a cart, but by a long broom. It's a broom handle. So it's sort of a broom it's a cart, broom handle, and janitor linked together, which sort of mirrors the behaviour of the elephants. It's fantastic. You'll see it on the assignments page. Jean-Maurice in Toronto, just perfect. And I'll be sending a show flask to you. What have you found, pups? What have you got? What have you got? You got the lot? Come on, this way. Now, I know you're going to say I made this up, so you'll just have to go with me on this. But I've just met a man called Martin. Just met a man called Martin. Sounds like the start of a song, pups, doesn't it? And we had a long old chat. He was, I held a gate open for him because he was struggling a bit with his bike and all fingers and thumbs and trying to do everything at once and not managing really. But we had a long old chat, a long chat. which started with, it feels a bit funny, doesn't it? What's happening in the world? And it was a chat about, his business that went a bit south. Well, went south, thanks to that word that starts with C, ends with D. And so we had a chat, an encounter, yes. And then I said, could I get a picture of you? And he said, I'd rather not. And that was fine. Absolutely fine. But it was a good 10-minute encounter. I should have recorded it. Just before I returned to my conversation with Ted Forbes, we've been talking for a while about the possibility of finding a photographer that deals with the paranormal. 5 years this show has been running. Are you into your 6th year, Neil? Yes, I believe we are. But still nothing. I've mentioned it a few times. But as far as a guest goes, I've come up against a bit of a brick wall in what is, I think, what seems like a guarded genre, if it is indeed a genre, the paranormal. But my interest to try and find somebody to talk to has been rejiggled by a very short note and a picture from our good friend Paul Friday, who a couple of months back sent me a picture of Coniston Lake in Cumbria's Lake District. Absolutely gorgeous. Well, the lake and the Lake District. And it was on the back of us talking on one of our shows, and I'm trying to remember exactly why now, about the great Donald Campbell. Now, if you're a bit sketchy on the name of the place, Donald Campbell's tragic record attempt to become the fastest man on water took place on a glassy Coniston Water in 1967, the 3rd largest lake in the Lake District, so a good place to do it. It's about 5 miles long and half a mile wide. And this is a story etched in British history, partly because photography played a crucial role in documenting that fateful day. Donald Campbell was piloting his Bluebird K7, chasing this new water speed record, when the craft flipped over at 300 miles an hour, disintegrating on impact when it came back down to the water. And a photographer on shore, a man called Peter Keane, captured the whole sequence. This hydroplane lifting up into the air, and then the disaster strikes. The photos became iconic. Of course, they're horrific pictures in many respects, particularly to the family, but they did become iconic pictures. So the pic sent in from Paul Friday is from Coniston, and he sent it in with the words, "You were speaking on the show about Coniston and Donald Campbell. Well, I was there recently, and I took this picture, but I couldn't get over the feeling that I was being watched." Now, perhaps there was an ounce of what I call a creative's over-imagination, or if I did look this up, actually, and there's actually another expression for it. It's called unrestrained visualization. But I have to say, I often feel that if I had hairs to stand on ends on my head, I have to say that I've often felt that when I've been on these walks, particularly when I come across a building that's abandoned. Barney Sabark a lot. He's the only one brave enough to look inside. Me, I'm like, I'll come back another day, Barnes, when I've got Mally with me or something. I do love the idea of urban exploration, but Blair Witch has somewhat affected the party. But I am interested in this idea of photography about the supernatural and the unexplained. It's just that the photographers who do it are, well, a little shy is probably the right word. It's certainly not a new thing either. It's not a new obsession in terms of the photographers who've done it. I did do some research. I came up with some names. William H. Mumler claimed to have photographed spirits alongside the living. His most famous image showed Mary Todd Lincoln with the ghost of Abraham Lincoln beside her or behind her. Of course, many of these early pictures, they would be debunked, wouldn't they, as double exposures, or you've done something clever with a trickery. No Photoshop, of course, in those days, but you're still able to do some quite incredible, well, what would have been incredible at that time, things with photographs. But today's paranormal photographers, now that's why I'm quite interested to talk to one, because they've got all sorts of new gadgets. infrared cameras, thermal imaging, long exposure techniques. And one standout is Simon Marsden, who's a British photographer who devoted his life to capturing the eerie. He made some pretty haunting black and white images of crumbly castles, I know, and misty graveyards and mysterious shadows that have an otherworldly quality. Although, to be fair, he didn't claim to see ghosts. So, no, he didn't see ghosts, and he's no longer with us, actually. But then I found Shannon Taggart, who's an American photographer, and she documents spiritualist communities and seances. And she does do talks on them as well. And she had it's the word opulent book, seance. It showcases strange ethereal images of mediums, mysterious lights, moments that, quote, feel both deeply human and otherworldly. There's that word again. Skeptics, of course, say it's all dust particles, camera glitches, and so on. And we spoke to the amazing photographer Stephen Wilkes about his day-to-night project. Do you remember that? And a trip that he made to Ellis Island, which resulted in some very intriguing and unexpected presences within his pictures. Stephen, I don't think, is a man taken to over-exaggeration, and he wasn't comfortable at all in that abandoned part of Ellis Island in the hospital wing, if you remember. Anyway, I thought I'd give it another go to try and find somebody at the start of 2025, because one of the things I like to do is pick out lots of different genres and interests, and I think it might result in a very interesting programme. I'm kind of taken on inviting our friend Mally Davis to go and make a midnight walk somewhere, but we'd end up frightening each other stupid, I'm sure. Anyway, I've written to Shannon to start with to see what she says. William Mumler is of course deceased. I did say that so too is Simon Marsden, and I'm not sure that, as clever as Zoom is, I'm not sure it operates on a 2 knocks for connection basis. So watch this space. We may be getting closer to that elusive show and interview. Neil, I'll be hiding behind your sofa for that episode. You and me both, probably. Right. Hang on, we're being buzzed. There we go. They're coming out. The clouds have cleared. The blue sky. Yeah. Means we're going to have a few more aircraft. They do like to visit the Common. I think this is a good... It's a good waypoint, actually, for many aircraft. Right, part 2 then of my chat with Ted Forbes, talking this week about his new book, Visually Speaking. Legacy is another thing that you talk about. It's a strong part of this book. That's music to my ears. So legacy is a word I moot so often. It really is a way to leave our mark, to show what we saw, what we love, what we found curiously fascinating. And it's something that's very important within the pages, isn't it?
Absolutely. And there's a whole chapter on that in there. And you know, it's funny because like a lot of people who get into something, I mean, we all start the same way. It's a hobby at first. You know, there's something about the camera that's fascinating, or the act of taking a photograph and then seeing it later. I mean, that's what drew me in, you know, when I was real young. Or maybe, you know, even you and I who have the media element, there's something that's fascinating about making a video where I get to talk about photography, or you making a long form content piece where you get to speak about it too. And then we get serious about it later. But I think what most photographers, and maybe I've struggled with it, and that's why I'm talking about it so much, but we don't think about that legacy. And I've had the fortune and opportunity to work with some of my heroes in photography. Like if you told me that I would have worked with Ralph Gibson one day when I was starting out, I mean, you could have like knocked me over. I mean, I wouldn't have believed it. I remember there was a point, and it was right around that point where I realized that music wasn't going to work. And I was working in a startup company doing CD-ROMs back during the tech boom. And my social life was kind of work-based. But so a lot of times on Friday night, I remember we still had bookstores back in those days. And I would go up to Borders, drink coffee, spill it on their books, and just look at stuff. And then I would go over to the half-price bookstore, the used books. And that's where a lot of my collection was built from, because it was stuff I could afford. Yeah. But those were the people that I was looking at. I remember when I discovered this guy named Ralph Gibson, and his art form was the book. That was his medium. He enjoyed doing, and he still to this day, he does more than an exhibition or more than social media even. I mean, the book is the final, that's what he's making. But, I've had the fortunate opportunity to work with Ralph, and I know Ralph very well at this point. We've become friends. There are others too that, it's just observations that I've made being around people who've had very successful careers, is that they consciously from day one have controlled their legacy. They've designed who they are. They've designed what they want to leave behind. They've designed the work that they do, and they're obsessive about it. They just think about it 24/7. They talk about it 24/7. And you really do have to have that hunger and that taste for it. And I think that we're all taught when we're younger, don't be arrogant, don't, and you can control it. You don't have to be arrogant to people, but you do need to be obsessive about your own work and what it is that you're doing. It's okay to do that. Yeah. And I feel like my work took a big turn, and much thanks to Ralph, because I had the opportunity to kind of study one-on-one. And I'll tell you, this is what he focused on with me, is he said, Ted, you got to start looking at the work. You've got to spend time with it. Because we started by going in and taking some of my older photographs and just slightly recropping them. And Ralph would do it in a way that just changed the composition. He said, do you see what I did here? And I'm like, yes, I do. And he said, well, he always calls me Theodore, you've got to start learning how to do this in camera. And he's right. And so I started really paying attention to the corners when I'm looking through the lens, and what is my composition, and is this the right crop? And it's also a matter of spending time with your work. You need to have a relationship to the work, and the work has a relationship to you.
Very much.
It won't happen immediately. And one of the most encouraging things that Ralph told me, that I'll share with your audience too, because I think it's very inspiring, but he was really good friends with Helmut Newton. There was a point where I was talking to Ralph, and I said, the thing that frustrates me is I feel like, there's no time limit on anything. I understand all that, but, I feel like I'm trying to get good, and I'm not exactly a young guy anymore, right? I'm past 50. And he said, look, it doesn't matter. He said, Helmut said he wasn't any good till he got to 50, and I was like, wow, if Helmut Newton could say something like that, that's kind of cool. Yeah. And Helmut's work did change after he turned 50. And he worked in the commercial world. There were art directors telling him what to do up to a point, and then he got to be a big name and he was directing that. But that's what it comes down to. And I think that's when we loop this back around to legacy, is that's how you define your legacy. That's how you work on that. It comes down to the relationship with you and the work that you're producing.
Pictures are very visceral. Photography is a visceral thing. I have one picture in particular that has remained with me since I saw it in a national newspaper many years ago. It was the tragic Lockerbie airline bombing. It's a picture of a 747, the nose of that Pan Am 747 in a field at Tundergarth. It's a place I visited myself, actually, to see where the picture was made. And I feel very blessed to have spoken with Tom Stoddart, who took that picture, the late Tom Stoddart. Is there a similar photograph for you that has that visceral feeling that has... Because that photograph still drives me. I don't emulate it, of course, because I'm not photographing things like it. But it remains very much with me.
But it's a strong composition. I know the picture you're talking about. It's strong. It makes a statement. The photograph for me, and I talk about in the book that it's just weird. I always come back to is Arnold Newman's portrait of Igor Stravinsky. I believe that's visceral, but in a less dramatic way. It's visceral. It's subtly visceral. Yeah. But it is, because it burns that composition into your brain. And I remember seeing that as a kid. And it was one of the first photographs where I realized what visual communication was, even though my brain hadn't processed it that way at that point in my life. But I remember very specifically seeing that picture, and I didn't know who Igor Stravinsky was at that time in my life. I was really young, but I knew that this guy was a musician because he's sitting there at a piano. And I love the fact that you didn't see the entire piano. It's just the lid.
Oh, this is the B flat picture, isn't it? The
B flat. Yeah. That's the one.
Yeah.
That's the one. And it's so ingenious on that level, because that's a perfect, and I show this in the book, and the Newman Estate let us use that for the book. I didn't think we'd get the uncropped version, but they were cool about it, and they let us have it. But you can see the 4x5 that was done, and then it was later where he went in and said, this is going to be the image. But again, that brings it back to the subtractive idea of photography. And of course, that wasn't in the moment. That was done in the darkroom later, and there was time involved. But, that's the interesting thing is when you look at just the visceral moments of photography, though, like the plane in the field, I think the famous Hindenburg crashing. Oh, God, yeah. Nick Yutt's image, of the napalm girl. Yeah. These are strong things that and I think that really represents the power of what photography can be. we've have moments that were caught 9/11, that have video footage to them, seeing a plane go into a building. But they show us something that we're not there to see. But yeah, photography does have a visceral way of burning that into your mind in a different way, but not because it's a photograph. Because it's a really good photograph. The composition's right. And to be the type of photographer, like you're talking about that Pan Am image, that is able to get that in the moment. I'm not a photojournalist, so part of me is just this fantasy of being in a moment of utter chaos and still being able to tune your brain into the fact that I've got to make pictures. It would be very difficult for me to do this. And then stay on top of your game and get your best stuff. You know what I mean? Sometimes it probably just comes together, but they have to be intentional about it because that's their career, But yeah, there's a huge power in photography, and there are photographs. I hope everybody has a photograph that drives them. I mean, there are others. The Stravinsky photograph's one of them, but I mean, there are other examples of things that I've discovered more recently. I don't know if you've ever seen Alexei Brodovich, who was known as an art director. He worked with Avedon and Penn and restructured the fashion industry and photography, or in New York in the 50s and 60s when they redesigned those magazines. He was a photographer also, and not a lot of his work exists, but he did one book called Ballet, which is some of the most amazing ballet pictures I have ever seen. If you can find it, it's very difficult. There was a reprint of it. The original doesn't exist anymore. It was stored in a barn that burned down, but there's a reprint of the book. It's weird. The book's inside the book, but it's really cool. And he was shooting on ISO 50 or 100 film with a 3.5 f-stop lens. I mean, and so there's a lot of blurring of things, but it's a wonderful example of how somebody can push something all the way up to the extent that the medium will allow. And by today's standards, people would look at those photographs and say, well, why are they blurry? Because we have high ISOs now and we have, f 0.95 lenses or whatever. But he was able to work within the confines of what he was working with. And that's something that's very impressive.
I do like this expression of having the perfect imperfect, though, and that sort of describes those moments perfectly. You've mentioned subtraction a couple of times, so it's probably a good opportunity for me to say, look, 21 chapters. I know it's taken 2 years to do this, but 21 chapters. How do you decide what to leave out and what to put in?
Pretty much everything went into that. But I mean, it was literally like the publisher was really cool with that. They said, what do you want to do? Well, let's start with they want to see the table of contents just to kind of make sure that we, I had to prove to them that we were actually going to write a book and not just talk about it. So the table of contents came first, and it just gave me a way to kind of organize my thoughts and try to give a 360 view of my approach to photography within this context of comparing it to a visual language. I mean, there's more that I've got that I could write about, but for this topic, I literally got to write about everything that I wanted to in there. I mean, since I finished it, there are other things that you're like, oh, I should have put that in there, whatever. Images were another big one because, it was going to be a big book in the end. I mean, it was 360 pages. Yeah. And, we're filling that out with images. And, I think we're all like this. I have a relationship with my work, but then I've taken stuff recently and like literally at the 11th hour, I'm like sticking more images in there. Sorry to the designer. They were very nice with me, so it worked out. But
what's the ratio between your pictures and photographs to describe the art?
The book is made up of probably 95% my images. And then there are some others, particularly in one of the early chapters where I'm talking about developing one's voice. I'm talking about interpreting. I can't do that solely with my work because I'm talking about different ways of doing it. Yeah. And so, we talked about Graciela Iturbide and that picture of Frida Kahlo that she's got, and it's her feet in Frida's tub. Keith Carter is another one. These are photographers that, one, I know and I've worked with, but they're also heroes of mine. Graciela is one of the most amazing photographers to ever grace this planet, and one of the best photographers that Mexico has ever produced. She is just unbelievable, and that was such a that was a real nervous moment when I met her. I mean, she's really sage, so it's like you feel like you're going up on top of this mountain to meet, the guy who's going to give you the monk who's going to give you the meaning of life or something, and she's really sweet too. But anyway, so I used their photographs to describe a lot of that, and then there are certain chapters in the book where I needed to take photographs to illustrate something. There's one that actually was really successful in the end, I think, but I was talking about reduction and ways to crop things out. And you're going to see a series of images of a chair. It's a chair that sits in my living room. One, that's very difficult to photograph things that are in your house and take them seriously because you see them every day. You're not exactly inspired by that in the same way of, going to a foreign country and photographing. But I needed to be able to describe the idea that if we are dealing with a subtractive medium. How tight can I make that crop? And, you could take anything as an example. And when I wrote that, I literally was looking at the chair. I was writing that in my living room. And I said, so you could take an image of a chair. And if I start reducing that and cropping in and getting tighter and tighter, you're going to get to a point where it's no longer recognizable as a chair, right? Yeah. You're just going to see a piece of wood that goes by. And you don't have enough context or information as the viewer to know that it's a chair. But what was interesting is when we laid that out, we put all those images side by side. It's this really weird deconstructionist example of that chair, which is kind of another way that you could take photography and doing something in a series of images that describes something visually, where on their own, they don't make sense, but together, they make perfect sense. You can do that with a portrait. You could deconstruct a human's face and put that in different images, but they all have to work together. So maybe that's catalyst for another chapter in another book one day.
I feel a reprint coming on with another chapter.
The second edition.
The 22nd chapter. It would be amiss of me if I didn't mention YouTube. Oh, we've mentioned it a few times already, but your channel and YouTube's a great place to go for photographic education. Sure. So many photographers profess that was probably their art school in a way that I can't claim. I didn't grow up with YouTube being available.
No, right.
This book, your book, is proof that books are still considered an important place of learning. How much has the landscape for good photographic books changed? What has YouTube done in that respect?
Well, there's two different things. I mean, I think that I don't know that YouTube killed the photo book necessarily. I think the book industry may have killed the photo book. When you get into, I think YouTube relates, and I think you can probably relate to this a little bit too. But there is the side of what we do that's about the numbers. And you want things to scale if you're going to do them as a business. Yeah. YouTube is like that. The book industry is like that. Yeah. It all is. But then we're also, what you and I are talking about right now is something that is going to really only resonate with a small group of people. But it's a very important thing, and it's a very important group of people. Yeah. And those are two very different things. And I've always, there have been times in my career where I've been very conflicted with that. When I started having to do gear reviews, because I want to try to build a bigger audience. I'm doing this for a living. You have to do that. But I still have to provide for my own sanity the quality content that smaller audience wants to see. And if people come for the gear and they stay for the other stuff, I think that's fine too. So anyway, those are two sides to it. In the United States, which is probably what I'm going to be able to speak the most to, and I'll tell you why in a second. It used to be you would go into bookstores, and I remember the era I was talking about where I'd go on Friday nights and spend my evening at the bookstore learning. Back then, you would have shelves and shelves and shelves of photography. There'd be probably, I remember there was like 4 aisles of photography books at Borders, and at the used bookstore it was even more. And you could find everything. It was such a cool time. And the photographers you'd never heard of, and they got a book. You go look there, and they're all together. So I can go do this in one evening. It was sort of, this is pre-YouTube, so it was, a similar thing to being able to flip through YouTube channels. It was just different though, because it's reduced to the work. I don't get the talking head. I'm only looking at what they're saying visually. That's a component we're missing now with YouTube, I think, a little bit. Now, when you go, first of all, if you can even find a bookstore, we still have Barnes & Noble, I think, in town. Yeah, we have one by the house. Mm. If you go there's one lonely little shelf of photography books. Yeah. And it's usually an Ansel Adams book, an Annie Leibovitz book, and then you have a bunch of how-to books. And so that's what the photo industry, at least in the U.S., the photo book industry is reduced to, because it's hard to sell. I review so many books on my channel. And I've said this in videos, I will have people that go look at a video that's 16 years old where I talk about some book that is long out of print, and they go try and find it, and it's on Amazon or eBay from a private seller for, over $1,000. Mm. And it's like, guys, if you see the book, get it. It's not going to stay in print. Nothing does. I hope my book stays in print, but I don't want to jinx it. But my book's also very different because there's something in it for the viewer. It's not just a portfolio of images. Mm. But I think that makes it difficult for the printing industry. Having said that, though, I just got back from Japan this weekend, and I went to a bookstore in Japan. And I always say Japan's like going to another planet because, like, the trees are different, the birds are different. Everything is just wild. The food's different. It's just this whole new experience. The bookstores are different, and that's a good thing too, because there's a printing industry with books that's alive and well in Japan. I mean, I went over there, and Luigi Giri, who's a very obscure photographer, I think, for most people, Italian photographer from the 80s who was very conceptual. And they had like 6 Luigi Ghiri books. They had Saul Leiter, who's hot right now. They probably had 6 different Saul Leiter books that were in there. I mean, it was just wild. It was like, this is book heaven. I mean, it was all I could do to stop from going down and buying another suitcase and stuffing it full of stuff to bring home. But I have to go back, and next time I'll probably do that.
Were you sat in the corner just dropping coffee on the books again? Was it just
no, I did not drop coffee on the books this time. But I had a dinner to go to, so I couldn't spend very long in there. But it was very agonizing.
Does photography or photographers, does it continually surprise you through the work that you do on your YouTube channel and the talks that you do?
If you mean surprise in the, oh my gosh, I've never seen this. Yeah, I am always continually finding stuff. And the cool thing is like we were talking about this earlier, there's this kind of sliver of interest where, those of us that are real serious about something, we're not big numbers of people, but it's important. And that's where that lives. And because it's always kind of been like that, you can go through history. And like my latest thing is I went on this kick, and it was, long story short, I was researching something with Nikon. And when they got put on the map, it was when David Douglas Duncan went to go shoot the Korean War, and he was using Nikon lenses on his Leica. Nobody had heard of the company, but he was friends with this guy, Jun Mickey. And I'm like, who's Jun Mickey? He was this Japanese photographer. He's incredible photojournalist. He was the first Japanese photographer to be featured on the cover of Life magazine. And he has 2 books. You can start to research very little information, but he must have been an incredible guy. He died in the 90s, I think. And then that led me down the rabbit hole of a bunch of other obscure Japanese photographers. And sometimes you have to dig, but you can find their books. And that kind of thing, I mean, it's all of the 60s, and their photos are very 1960s looking. But I mean, full disclosure, I've watched Mad Men like 3 times. So, I mean, I love the 60s, and I love that kind of work. And so that's always surprising me. And then there's contemporary photographers, like people like Hiroshi Sugimoto. And he's hot on my mind because we went and saw he built this observatory in Japan that's kind of a museum-ish thing. But I think that he's probably one of the most incredible photographers in the world in terms of working conceptually. He'll go through a series, and sometimes you'll see the series and it's like, I don't get it or I don't like it. And then like a year later, I'm like, damn it, I wish I'd done that. Like the lightning fields where he was just like hitting a sheet of paper with electricity and creating an abstract. I mean, how Jackson Pollock is that? And I can't think of those things. And so I'm constantly surprised and inspired by people like that do just incredible work. They're out there. It's just a matter of finding them. But I also, because, and I can say this because I used to work at an art museum, the fine art world, there's some really big names who do well with that. But like, there's a game that photographers and artists play to be relevant to contemporary photographers, and they're in the right collections, and therefore they get in the right museums, and that's not of interest to me. God bless Cindy Sherman. I think her early work in her career was amazing, but I just don't think she's surprising me anymore. That's not really a slam on her. Her early work's amazing, but there are people out there that are really pushing the envelope and continually surprising us with what they do.
I've just got a couple more questions, actually. This one's a bit left field, I suppose, but my and everything seems to come back to radio for me, but my favorite radio program for its absolute simplicity and long-standing nature is a show called Desert Island Discs. I don't know whether you've ever heard of it, but essentially you get cast away on an island and you play, I think it's 8 songs. You're given. What do you take with you? Yeah, what do you take with you, and so on and so forth. And the guests on the show are asked to choose one of those songs. I don't know how it works with electricity in a record player, but they can have one of those songs, and that goes to the desert island with them. Maybe, yes, it would be these days. But I'm going to put a slight twist on that. And I will ask, because you're such a collector of them, if you could only take one of your photographic books to an island, what one is it? I mean, this might well be the last book you ever have the privilege to read. What would it be?
Ooh, that's a tough one. For me, it would be, off the top of my head, something obscure. I mean, one book that comes to mind, I don't know if you're familiar with Tom Burrell or not. He's a photographer who used to be big on the gallery scene, and he's kind of retired from it about 10, 20 years ago. And I've hunted him down and met him. He's a brilliant guy. He was Robert Mapplethorpe's printer. But Tom Burrell did 2 books. One's called Botanica, which is beautiful. And the other one is just under his name, Tom Burrell. That would be the book. That was one that I wanted, and it was hard for me to find. It took me about 4 years and was really patient. And I found it, and it was not overpriced. I found it in a photography gallery. It was the gallerist's copy. Yeah, it was cool. It had water damage, so they only charged me like $40 for it. But I still have it, and it's one that I refer back to. And Tom Burrell has He's a unique photographer, extraordinarily good. Shoots a lot of pinhole, shoots a lot of 4x5 collodion. He was one of the first guys to doing collodion when that was kind of coming back. And you see his influences. He wears them on his screen. People like Carl Blossfeldt, even Robert Mapplethorpe to that degree. He's kind of a culmination of those things. But he had made such an impact on me. So, I mean, it's a very personal answer on that. If it weren't for that book, I think it would be maybe, I don't know if it'd be the decisive moment or not. I love that book. Some of W. Gene Smith's books are interesting to me because they were never really completed. He always saw his work more massive than what could be put into something. So they end up being greatest hits collections. But I think just as far as the book goes, I think it would be Tom's book. He was pretty incredible.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you.
Absolutely, likewise.
I don't know whether now to address you as Theodore or Ted.
Either one.
But Ted, it's a question I ask of photographers at the end, and I'm really interested to know what your answer will be. What's your why?
I think that there's two sides to this because one, I don't have a choice. I do what I do because it's what I have to do. There's something inside of me that has to create something. And it used to be music for me, but now I found my real calling in my home is photography and it's photographs. I have to make them. If I go, I mean, we've all done it where, maybe you get sick or something, or there's some reason why you can't go photo, or we just get busy, or a tax season. There's a good one. I have to sit here and work on spreadsheets for a week. We won't speak of such things, but when you come out of that, we'll speak about this. I'm always so relieved because I'm back to being able to make pictures again, and I don't successfully do it every day. That's fascinating too. It's a constant journey, and it's a constant struggle that we all do on this. And people have asked me about that before too. And the reality is if it were easy and we could all make great pictures like Richard Avedon or Irving Penn tomorrow, we wouldn't do it because there'd be no reason. I mean, I think that the journey of that is half the excitement of it. There's an interesting quote. Rick Rubin, music producer, I don't know if you've seen his book on creativity that came out, I believe, last year or the year before, one of the two. Highly, highly recommended. It's hard to read because it's so full of zingers that you get about 4 pages in, your brain's overloaded, and you have to stop and think about it for a while. And if you get the audio version, there's gongs in the back. It's very zen. But it's a great book. But one of the ways he looks at it, and you can tell so many of his opinions are formed by working with rock bands like Red Hot Chili Peppers and such, or Black Sabbath or whatever, or he's babysitting essentially, I think, to a degree. But he talks about finishing work and he talks about releasing work. And he said, your output is more or less a diary of where you are in your creative development as a photographer, as an artist. And I believe this too. There are people that don't want to put the book out, or they don't want to put the work up on Instagram, because they're not quite there yet. And the reality is it's just work is never more than a snapshot of where you were at that point of time. If you look at some of the greatest bands in the world who had the greatest records, like Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin 1 is not the end of Led Zeppelin. It's the beginning of Led Zeppelin, but it's a snapshot of where they were in 69. Led Zeppelin 2 is a snapshot of where they were in 70. And same thing with Dark Side of the Moon or any of these other records. Or Beethoven's Fifth. That was not the greatest piece he ever wrote. It was not the last piece he wrote, but it was a finished piece that represented Beethoven at that point in his career. I think you could say the same for any photographer. You could say the same for any artist. That's a long why, but the short why is because I have to.
And my sincere thanks to Ted Forbes this week, who will be coming back at some stage, April onwards, to talk more about his own work, his channel, and the various art series that he's worked on as well, that we didn't get a chance to touch on in our chat today. Very much an inspiration to me is Ted. It has been for a long time now. Talking of inspirations, I did a show, it must have been September, where I talked about life's mentors. And one of those mentioned on the show, actually, was not my photographic mentor, but the mentor that I had in terms of broadcasting and radio. And I'm going to see him, hopefully, snow permitting, because we've been told we've got quite a lot on the way. And I don't really fancy camping out on the M25, the orbital, the London orbital. But I'm hoping to go and see him tomorrow, if you're listening to this on the day of the intended day of release. Robbie is his name, and I'm going to go and make some portraits of him. And so I thought I'd turn that probably into an Extra Mile episode, actually, of which I'll talk more about in a moment. Now, Ted mentioned Graciela Iturbide, a Mexican photographer, in the second half of our chat. And I'm all the richer for the introduction because I spent a long time poring over her work online. Graciela is a renowned Mexican photographer celebrated for, quote, her evocative black and white images that explore Mexico's indigenous cultures, rituals, and daily life. I love the idea as well that the site has this strong representation of her personal documentation atop all the projects. In particular, and it definitely bleeps on my curiosity radar, that she has a part of her website, not sadly a large part or large collection, but all the same it's there, and it's called Travel Notebook. This wonderful idea of sketchbooking with your camera, of your camera being a travel notebook. I love that idea. Anything that, come on this way, pups, anything that enthuses you to want to reach for your camera more, I think is a good thing. Certainly where you appreciate it as being something that you can use to be a collector of life. And so that's it for today. If you can't wait until next Friday and want to walk a little bit further together, then the Extra Mile edition number 120 is waiting for you. The Extra Mile is part of our private Patreon channel, supported by our wonderful community that we call Extra Milers each week. There's an extra show, which often features our community as stars of that show. And this week, Extra Miler Marilyn Davis from Brisbane, from Brizzy, joins me. And there's a taster of what's waiting for you right here.
On this week's Extra Mile.
I don't go to air shows to watch the aeroplanes.
No.
I go to air shows to watch the people.
Don't tell anybody.
Well, my husband's ex-RAAF, and he's there looking at all the aeroplanes, and I'm looking at all the people.
I just find people fascinating at air shows.
Yeah.
But they are. So sorry, you were at.
Yeah, well, I'm walking through the crowd at this air show, and there were two Marines coming, US Marines coming the opposite direction. I just locked eyes with them, camera up, took their photo, big smiles from them both, and that was a connection. And that's a moment that you remember. It wasn't this blurry thing, I went to an air show once and I saw lots of planes. I went to an air show and I saw lots of people getting involved in the event and enjoying the event.
The first 5 minutes of the show is available for free. So click the link on the website. You'll find a link on photowalk.show in the menu that takes you to the Extra Mile. Our PS to the show is to come, but before that we need a play-out song just to make some final frames to. I'll think about what's been said today. Now, I'm starting the year with what? He's all the way in the distance. Come on, pups. I'm doing the play-out song. This way. I'm starting the year with a dab of jazz. I'm thinking my guest, Ted Forbes, would like jazz. And I found this song from an artist I really like called Anthony Lazzaro. The song is called Cold. And I picked it for two reasons. One, and the main one, I just love the song. But two, I can very loosely shoehorn into the intro that we're in for a cold snap, which started a few hours ago, I think. We went from storm to cold snap in less time than it takes my X100V battery to show me the "please can I go into hibernation until April" icon. If you've not seen that one, just top right-hand corner, it's there.
Be careful, child, never play with fire. Your mama said his words, oh, so many times. I'm thinking you knew better than the other guys, riding on backbiting and get away with lies. No matter what it takes, always gonna cry. The only thing that matters is you get what you desire. But I know for sure today will come when you first realize what you have done, and you finally get your debt repaid, and your vengeance served on a cold plate. You hear the for help, that we only think about ourselves, oh yeah. The first time that I met you, I thought it looked so sweet. I stood around for the hills, beating a retreat. And when I heard you talking with that alluring sound, should have recalled the sirens and how that things went down. Living on the trenches, looking for a way to escape. You always cut me down like a dreamers with the grapes. But never mind how I tried to leave you behind. I kept falling in your net. Oh, I've been so blind. But I know for sure the day will come when you first realize what have you done, and you finally get your debt repaid and revenge is served on a cold blade. And you hear the roar of the shutdown when the world will stop without a sound. And the moment you will cry for help, and we only think about ourselves, oh yeah. About ourselves. About ourselves. But I know for sure that day will come when you first realize what you have done, and you finally get your debt repaid and revenge is served on a cold plate, oh yeah. On a cold plate. On a cold plate. On a cold plate.
That's Anthony Lazzaro and Cold. Right, let's do a final sketchbook, shall we? What do we do? Perhaps we're back into woodland. We ventured out into the commons, but we've sort of finished. Well, we finished the walk back in the woodland, an area which I really love. So let's make a chaos picture, shall we? Perhaps just a sketchbook image to show where we've walked. Shutter speed 1250, f3.6. Oh, hold on. Focus. What did I say about going into hibernation mode? Not focusing. There we go. A final sketchbook picture from today's walk. As we now officially start 2025, my sincere thanks to you if you are or you're about to become an extra miler. We'll keep building this community that we've got here, a community of kindness in the photographic and walking world together. My thanks to Neil Ford, who looks after IT, Andrea Gilpin, who's across Instagram, and Kelly Mitchell, who looks after our Facebook members. Right, a postscript for the show. Now, I went looking for New Year's ones, and I must admit there's more cheese than I was expecting. It is like a scene from inside what I'm now calling the New Year refrigerator of doom, as I've referred to it already today. Leftovers with calorie counts that would have a dietitian running for the hills. But I did find this, and I've read and reread it a few times actually. But I think it's right, and I think it works just a few days into the new year. Ellen Goodman is the author behind this quote, a Pulitzer Prize-winning American journalist, and she said, "We spend January the 1st walking through our lives, room by room, drawing up a list of work to be done, things to be fixed, and cracks to be patched. Maybe this year, to balance that list, we ought to walk through those rooms, not looking for flaws, but looking for potential." I'll walk with you again soon, and let me just add this. The world is our gallery. Let's go fill it with some curiosity this year, shall we?
The Photo Walk is a Loading Zone production.